You ever knit a swatch? Measure it 3 times, squint at it until your eyes water, and still think, that can't be right. Here's the thing. Pattern gauge is not the boss of you. If you don't match it, that doesn't mean that you have to abandon the project or force yourself to knit tighter or looser like some kind of human tension regulator. It just means we're going to outsmart it. Because guess what? You are smarter than a swatch. Speak for yourself, Oscar. In this 15-minute masterclass, I'm going to show you how to take the gauge you actually knit and make the pattern work for you so you get the sweater you want and not the sweater that accidentally fits your cat. Don't hold your breath, dog. Needles up. Let's get to class. Gauge, what it actually means and why it matters. Gauge is one of those things that can make or break a project, but it's also kind of misunderstood. So let's break it down. Your gauge equals your stitch and row density within a particular piece of your knitting. It's almost always measured over how many stitches and rows you have per 4 inches of your fabric. The more stitches per inch, the smaller each stitch is. The fewer stitches per inch, the larger each stitch is. And row gauge works the same way. The more rows per inch means shorter rows. The fewer rows per inch means taller rows. And note, knit stitches are not square. They are usually wider than they are tall. The average ratio is 5:4 width to height. That's why you almost always see gauge measurements with more rows than stitches. Here are some things that gauge affects. Size. A sweater knit at a different gauge might be way too big because the stitches are too big, or way too small because the stitches are too small. The fabric feel. A looser gauge gives you more drape, and a tighter gauge gives you a firmer fabric, mostly. Sometimes the fiber content can affect both of those things. Go check out my yarn substitution video to find out why. And yarn usage. Different gauges can eat up way more yarn than expected. Ask me how I know. Matching your gauge exactly is one way to get the right size, but it's not the only way. If your gauge is different, you just need to adjust a few things to make it work. So let's do that. All right, step 1, we're going to find your personal gauge, and yes, you must swatch. The first thing we need is to know our actual gauge. No guessing, no trusting the yarn label, no pretending like you've done this 100 times before and it's not going to matter. Knit a swatch. And if you need a refresher, or if you don't know how to swatch, or your swatches tend to not work for you, I have a masterclass for that. The link is up there. Measure your row gauge now and write it down before you block the swatch. We're going to measure it again after blocking. You'll understand why we're doing that a bit later. Now you can go ahead and block the swatch. Do not skip this step unless you plan to wear an unblocked sweater or never wash your sweater. And I know you wouldn't do either of those things, so go block your swatch. Once your swatch is completely dry, measure how many stitches and rows you get per 4 inches or 10 centimeters and write it down. Remember, you're going to have 2 sets of numbers for your row count, unblocked and blocked. Man, I was being bossy in that last segment, wasn't I? I can get a little intense about swatching. You may have noticed. Step 2, we are going to adjust the stitch counts in the pattern. There's math coming, so we are going to need our chalkboard today. Okay, let's say the pattern gauge is 20 stitches to 4 inches or 10 centimeters, but your personal gauge is 22 stitches to 4 inches. If you knit the pattern as written, your sweater will be too small because your stitches will be too small. We're going to take both the pattern gauge and your personal gauge and break them down into stitches per inch. Super handy number to know. Pattern gauge is 20 stitches to 4 inches. 20 divided by 4 is 5 stitches per inch. My personal gauge is 22 stitches to 4 inches. 22 divided by 4 is 5.5 stitches per inch. I have more stitches per inch than the pattern gauge. If I knit the pattern at this gauge, the sweater will be too small. So now what? I can change to a larger needle and make bigger stitches and hope that they match the pattern gauge. But what if they don't? What if my stitches end up bigger than the pattern gauge? There is no needle between this size and this size. Or maybe I really like the fabric I got at 5.5 stitches per inch, and I don't want to make my stitches smaller or bigger. What do? No biggie, a little bit of simple math is going to fix it. Here's an example. If the pattern's finished bust circumference is 40 inches and the pattern gauge is 5 stitches per inch, multiply that by 40 inches and you get 200 stitches total. If my personal gauge is 5.5 stitches per inch, I can multiply that by 40 inches and I get 220 stitches. Boom! Just like that, we need 220 stitches instead of 200 for the same size outcome at my or your personal gauge. Oscar, if eyeballing it worked, they wouldn't be here. All right, Nicole, fine. But what about rows? You said rows were a different size than stitches. Okay, smarty pants, you're on to me. Stitch gauge is easy. Row gauge is trickier, but I've got you covered. Put away the measuring tape and count rows instead. The truth is that measuring your unblocked knitting is a total crapshoot unless your unblocked and blocked row counts are exactly the same. If your stitches got even a little wee bit taller after blocking, then measuring unblocked knitting is not going to be accurate for your finished garment. That 8-inch armhole you measured could end up being 8.5, 9 inches, maybe even longer. And over a whole ton of rows, that could mean lots of extra inches in length after blocking and washing that you weren't expecting. Yep, right now your brain may be exploding or having a little party. Okay then, if we're not going to measure, how do I know how many rows to knit? If the pattern says knit for 8 inches at 5 rows per inch, that's 40 rows. But if your row gauge is 6 rows per inch, knitting 40 rows will only get you 6.5 inches instead of 8. The solution is do the new math. 6 rows per inch times 8 inches is 48 rows instead of 40. If you need help keeping track of rows or row adjustments, my masterclass on running markers will change your life. Yes, Oscar? Yes, it will. Okay, granted, sometimes things get a little bit more complicated with a pattern and you need to make pattern elements work with your new stitch count. So if your pattern has lace, cables, or color work, you might need to adjust the repeats or find places to make your new stitch count fit. You might even need to create some new places. For instance, you might add or remove stitches between pattern elements, or you might add an unpatterned section under the arms or in the center front and center back to accommodate extra stitches. Now, if a pattern is really complex and fully charted, like the one I'm wearing, here's a trick. You can knit at a different gauge in the sections that you want to make larger or smaller. This pattern had a straight up and down body and no place to adjust for stitch count. I wanted one measurement at the full bust, a different measurement at the waist, and another measurement altogether at the hip. To accommodate this, I didn't do one lick of math. I knit from just below the bust up to the shoulder and the sleeves on the needles called for by the pattern gauge, 5.5. I knit the waist area at a 5 to make the waist a bit smaller. I transitioned back to my 5.5 for a few rows and then finished off the hip area with a 6. That way I got a graduated hip slope. So I wasn't making a huge leap from this needle to 2 sizes larger. Pretty sneaky, hey? This is definitely going to be one of those swatch and see situations. But once you figured it out, you're golden. One more set of common adjustments that you might have to do when knitting at your personal gauge is changing the rate of your increases or decreases. This is just going to be a little bit of rows divided by stitches kind of math. Let's do a simple example. Let's say that your stitch gauge is 5 stitches per inch and you cast on 200 stitches for a 40-inch hip, but you want your waist to be 38 inches, not 40. 38 times 5 is 190. We started with 200 stitches. We want to reduce it to 190 stitches by the time we get to the waist. Now let's say we have 6 inches of knitting between our hem and the smallest part of the waist. So we want to eliminate 10 stitches over 6 inches. If our row gauge is 6 rows to the inch, 6 times 6 is 36. So we have 36 rows to decrease 10 stitches. Usually when we decrease for areas like waist shaping, we're decreasing 4 stitches in a round, 1 at each side on the front and 1 at each side on the back. So if we want to eliminate 10 stitches, we're going to divide 10 by 4. That gives us 2.5. So in other words, 1 decrease round would eliminate 4, a second decrease round would eliminate another 4, and our third decrease round would only eliminate 2. You could do that. You could just take an extra 2 off the back or off the front. That's up to you. Or you can balance it out and take out another 2 stitches. In the scheme of things, it's not going to make that much difference, but you get to pick. So what we know now is we need 3 decrease rounds and we have 36 rows in which to do those decrease rounds. 36 divided by 3 is 12. So you could knit 12, decrease, knit 12, decrease, knit 12, decrease. It's that straightforward. But really, you could put those decrease rounds anywhere in there you like. It doesn't have to be a perfectly even slope from wide to narrow. You could go more rows straight up and then do those decreases more quickly. There are lots of options. You get to pick. You have the control. And for increases, obviously, you're just going to reverse this math. And that's it. Gauge is a guideline, not a law. With a little math and a little planning, you can knit any pattern at your personal gauge. Now, go forth and knit freely. If you picked up anything today or this helped you out, please boop that like button, subscribe if you feel like it, and let us all know in the comments what your gauge struggles have been. I say goodbye. Oscar says goodbye. Now, you're going to need to write down all of your new personal gauge numbers somewhere on your pattern without getting confused by the original numbers. This video on creating a one-page pattern blueprint has the answers. Go watch it. Keep those needles clicking, and we will see you in the next masterclass. Bye!